The rain had been falling since morning, soft and steady, covering the city of Seattle in a calm gray mist. People hurried past with umbrellas while inside a small corner cafe. Warmth and the smell of coffee wrapped around everything. Emma sat by the window, sketchbook open, pencil moving quickly over the paper. Drawing faces of strangers was her habit, a quiet escape from her ordinary job and her quiet apartment. It was one of those afternoons when everything felt still, until the door opened and someone changed the rhythm of the room. He walked in, shaking raindrops from his coat. His name, though Emma didn't know it yet, was Ethan. He had the look of someone who carried too many thoughts focused, calm, yet lost somewhere else. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, and sat a few tables away from her, near the glass window. He opened a worn leather notebook and began to write, his head slightly bent, his fingers brushing his temple every now and then, as if his thoughts were heavier than his pen could handle. Emma tried to keep sketching, but her hand paused. Something about him made her curious. Maybe it was the way he looked outside instead of at people. Maybe it was the loneliness in his posture. She didn't know why, but she started sketching him without thinking, his coat draped over the chair, his half-empty cup, his eyes half hidden beneath his hair. Her pencil moved almost on its own. When she finally looked up, his gaze met hers. It wasn't awkward, but it wasn't comfortable either. Just one of those rare, silent connections that felt like a conversation without words. For a second, it seemed like he knew she had been drawing him, but instead of looking away, he smiled faintly. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the lips, but stays in the eyes. Emma quickly looked down, her heart beating faster for reasons she couldn't explain. Outside, the rain softened to a drizzle, and the cafe lights reflected golden across the wet street. Ethan turned a page in his journal, his pen moving again, and Emma imagined what he might be writing. Maybe poetry? Maybe a letter? Maybe something about someone he had lost. He looked like a man who carried both peace and pain inside him. She finished her sketch and looked at the clock. It was getting late and the cafe was starting to empty. She slipped her pencil into her bag, closed her sketchbook, and took one last look at him. He was still there, still writing, lost in whatever world existed on those pages. As Emma stood to leave, she hesitated. She wanted to say something, maybe compliment his handwriting, maybe ask what he was writing, or just say hello. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled quietly to herself, whispered goodbye in her mind, and turned toward the door. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as she stepped out into the cool evening air. The rain had stopped, but the ground still shimmered. Emma opened her umbrella just to feel less alone, even though she didn't need it. She took a few steps away, then stopped. Behind her, the door opened again. She turned, thinking maybe Ethan had left too. But it wasn't just him. Two people entered, a woman and a young boy, maybe 8 or 9. They both looked cheerful, laughing as they shook the rain off their jackets. The woman called out, "Ethan!" with a smile that sounded like home. Emma froze. She watched through the window as Ethan looked up, his serious face softening instantly. He stood, hugged the woman, and ruffled the boy's hair. He looked happy, completely different from the quiet stranger she had been studying all afternoon. For a moment, Emma felt foolish. She had imagined him as lonely, lost, someone quietly drifting like she was. But now, seeing him surrounded by warmth and laughter, she realized she had built a story in her head that wasn't real. Still, she didn't feel disappointed, just strangely touched. The image of him smiling at that woman, talking to the boy, felt genuine, kind. Maybe they were his family, maybe not, but they were clearly people he cared for. And somehow, that made him even more human to her. She turned away, walking down the quiet street toward the bus stop. The city lights blurred slightly through the light mist, still hanging in the air. She thought about how easy it was to see someone and imagine their story, to fill in the blanks with your own loneliness. Maybe everyone was carrying pieces of stories that others could never see. When she reached the corner, stopped under the streetlight, and opened her sketchbook again. On the page where she had drawn Ethan, she added a few more strokes. A child's hand on his arm. A woman's soft laugh beside him and a small note at the bottom that said, "He wasn't alone after all." Then she closed the book and smiled. The night felt lighter somehow. Maybe because she realized that even strangers could remind her that love in all its forms still existed. As she boarded the bus, she looked out the window once more. The cafe faded behind her, warm light glowing against the dark street. She didn't know if she'd ever see Ethan again, but she knew the moment had changed something in her. It wasn't love, not really, but it was something gentle, something she hadn't felt in a long time. And though she didn't know it yet, that simple, fleeting afternoon, the one she thought would end with silence, was only the beginning. Because life had a strange way of bringing people back into each other's stories. Just when you thought their chapter was over, Emma leaned her head against the glass. The city lights flashing by, her sketchbook resting in her lap. The rain began again, quiet and steady, as if the sky itself wanted to write the next line of her story. That was the day she thought he was alone. But it turned out it was the day she started to feel a little less alone herself. A week passed after that rainy afternoon, but Emma couldn't stop thinking about the man from the cafe. She tried to convince herself it was just curiosity. But deep down she knew it wasn't. Something about Ethan had stayed with her, the quietness in his eyes, the way he smiled without saying much. So one Thursday evening she found herself walking toward that same cafe again, pretending it was just for coffee. The truth was she hoped he'd be there. And he was. Ethan sat in the same seat by the window. The same journal open before him, a cup of black coffee steaming beside it. When he looked up and saw her, his face softened into a small, surprised smile. It wasn't the kind of smile you give to a stranger. It felt familiar. Warm. Emma hesitated for a second, then walked over. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, her voice careful but hopeful. He shook his head. "Not at all. You're the artist, right? The one who sketches strangers." She laughed quietly. "You remember that? Hard to forget someone who stares at you for an hour," he teased gently. The ice broke instantly. They started talking first about art and coffee, then about small things that didn't really matter but somehow felt important. Ethan told her he used to design buildings, but lately he hadn't been working much. "I needed time off," he said simply, though his tone hinted at something deeper. Emma didn't push. She knew that look, the kind of sadness that comes from loss. She just listened, nodding, sipping her drink slowly. When she mentioned her love for sketching people, he asked if she ever sold her art. She shook her head. "I just draw what I see. It's like my way of keeping moments alive." Ethan looked at her then, really looked as if those words meant something to him. "Maybe that's what I've been trying to do too," he said softly. "Keep moments alive." The rain outside started again, tapping lightly against the glass. The cafe felt smaller, quieter, as if the world had slowed down just for them. Emma couldn't remember the last time she felt so comfortable talking to someone. She barely knew. Hours passed without them noticing. They laughed about silly things like how Seattle rain never really stops, or how people pretend they love the weather just to sound poetic. Then their conversation turned deeper. Emma told him about moving to the city alone, chasing a dream she still wasn't sure of. Ethan shared how he used to travel often, but after losing someone, he found it hard to leave home. He didn't say who, and she didn't ask. Some silences didn't need filling. When the barista announced the cafe would close soon, Ethan looked at her sketchbook resting on the table. "Draw me sometime," he said, half smiling. Emma blushed a little. "I already did," she admitted, her fingers brushing the edge of the notebook. He looked surprised, then touched the back of his neck nervously. "Then I hope I looked better on paper than in person." "You did," she said honestly. "You looked real." It was a simple word, but it carried weight. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, like he wanted to say something, but before he could, his phone buzzed on the table. His expression changed immediately. The easy calm disappeared, replaced by something uncertain. He glanced at the screen, then back at her. "I should go," he said quietly. Emma blinked. "Oh, sure." She tried to smile, even though disappointment slipped through her tone. late meeting. He hesitated, lowering his voice. No, just, they're waiting. She asked, curious. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he smiled faintly, that same half-smile she had seen the first day. It's complicated. Before she could say another word, he stood, grabbed his coat, and left a few bills on the table for his drink. As he walked toward the door, he turned once and met her eyes. See you around, Emma? And then he was gone. She sat there for a long moment, staring at the door long after it closed. The sound of rain outside filled the silence. Part of her wanted to believe he'd come back, that maybe he'd forgotten something. Maybe he'd say one more thing, but he didn't. Emma packed her things slowly, feeling a quiet ache she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't heartbreak, not yet, but it was something close. A small, sharp emptiness that came from getting a glimpse of someone and realizing you wanted to know more. That night, lying in bed, she kept replaying their conversation. The way he spoke softly, how his eyes carried a story he didn't tell, the way his tone shifted when his phone rang. Who was they? A girlfriend? A wife? A family? Or maybe someone else entirely? She didn't know, and that uncertainty made it worse. Over the next few days, Emma went back to her normal life, her design job, her walks through the park, her quiet dinners alone. But everything felt a little duller now. She found herself sketching his face again. From memory, his focused eyes, his tired smile. The more she drew, the more real he became in her mind. A week later, she passed the cafe again after work. She told herself she wouldn't go in. She didn't want to look desperate or foolish. But something pulled her inside anyway. The place looked the same. The smell of roasted coffee beans, the chatter of people, the soft jazz music in the background. But Ethan wasn't there. She sat in her usual seat, ordered her drink, and stared at the empty chair across from her. For a brief second, she imagined him sitting there again, smiling, teasing her about her art. The memory felt too fresh, too alive. As she flipped through her sketchbook, she noticed something she hadn't before. The last page where she had drawn Ethan the first time. He was sitting alone, eyes on his journal. But the space beside him was blank. Empty. Emma took her pencil and started to fill it, a hand reaching toward him. A second cup of coffee on the table. She didn't know who the second figure was supposed to be. Maybe her, maybe someone else. But it made the drawing feel complete. By the time she finished, the cafe was closing again. She smiled to herself quietly and whispered, "See you around, Ethan?" When she stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The streets were shining, the air fresh. Somewhere deep down, she hoped their paths would cross again, not by accident, but because they were meant to. What she didn't know was that fate was already arranging that meeting. Ethan's story wasn't finished. He would return, and with him the truth that would change everything Emma thought she knew about him. For now, though, she walked home, heart full of questions, clutching her sketchbook like it carried a secret. The night felt both heavy and hopeful, the kind of night that promised more chapters ahead. Days turned into weeks, and life went on. But Ethan's memory stayed with Emma like a quiet echo. She tried to forget, but some faces don't fade easily. Sometimes she caught herself glancing into the cafe window on her way home, wondering if he'd be there again. Each time she told herself it didn't matter, that people meet and drift away all the time. But every time she passed that window and saw his empty seat, something inside her ached just a little. Then one afternoon, when spring sunlight began to melt away Seattle's long winter gray, she saw him again. He was sitting in that same seat by the window, his head tilted slightly as he laughed, a sound she had never heard from him before. For a split second, her heart lifted. But then she noticed he wasn't alone. Across from him sat a woman, bright eyes, kind smile, hair tied back loosely. And next to her, a small boy, maybe 8 or 9, coloring with crayons on a napkin. The three of them looked happy, almost like a family. Emma froze outside the cafe door, unsure whether to go in or walk away. A strange mix of relief and sadness ran through her. So that was they, she thought, the ones he had mentioned. She felt silly for not realizing sooner. Still, curiosity won. She stepped inside quietly, pretending to browse the pastry counter, just close enough to hear bits of their laughter. Ethan's voice was lighter now, free. The boy showed him a messy drawing, and Ethan laughed softly, ruffling his hair. The woman smiled at the sight, resting her hand on the boy's shoulder. It was a tender, genuine scene, one that made Emma's chest tighten. For a moment, she thought about leaving before anyone noticed. But then Ethan's eyes lifted and found hers. He looked surprised, almost caught off guard, then quickly stood up and excused himself from the table. He stepped toward her, a little unsure, a little guilty. "Emma," he said softly, his tone carrying both warmth and hesitation. "It's been a while." She nodded, trying to keep her voice even. "Yeah, I didn't expect to see you here again. Same cafe, same window," he said with a small, nervous smile. "Some habits are hard to break." Her eyes flicked toward the table where the woman and child sat. The woman noticed them and waved politely, her smile open and friendly. The boy, too, looked up curiously, grinning with a tooth missing in front. Emma felt her heart twist a little tighter. "You seem happy," she said, gently. Ethan followed her gaze and nodded. "I am," he said quietly. Then he looked back at her, reading the question she didn't ask. "She's not my wife," he added softly. "That's my sister Claire, and that's her son Liam." For a second, Emma just stared, the weight in her chest loosening. "Oh," she said, a small laugh slipping out in relief. "I thought," he smiled knowingly. "I know what you thought. Everyone does." They both laughed then, softly, awkwardly, like to people who had just stepped out of a fog. "After my brother-in-law passed," Ethan explained, "Claire and Liam moved in with me. It's been different. But they're my world now." Emma looked at him differently after that, not as a mystery, not as someone distant, but as a man who carried responsibility quietly, with heart. "That's really kind of you," she said. He shrugged. "It's what family does." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence. Then Claire waved him back over. "Come sit with us," Ethan said, gesturing to the table. "Join us for coffee." Emma hesitated, but agreed. The woman, Claire, was warm and easy to talk to, and little Liam made them laugh with his endless stories about school and superheroes. The atmosphere felt simple, human, safe. Still, every now and then, when Emma glanced at Ethan, there was something in his eyes, a softness that didn't feel like family. After they left, Ethan walked her outside. The air smelled like wet leaves and spring rain. "I didn't mean to disappear," he said quietly. Emma smiled. "You didn't disappear. You just had a life." He looked at her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I miss talking to you," he said. She felt her pulse quicken. "Then don't vanish again." He smiled at that, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. "Deal." From that day, things changed. They started seeing each other again, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. He'd stop by her art booth at the weekend market, and she'd drop by the cafe after work, knowing he'd probably be there. Their friendship grew naturally, without rush. Built on quiet moments, shared laughter, late talks, comfortable silences. Ethan often brought Liam along. The boy adored Emma, always asking her to draw things, superheroes, dragons, their small trio sitting at the cafe. Claire sometimes joined too, teasing Ethan about how much time he spent there. "You two talk like you've known each other for years," she'd say, and Ethan would just smile. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the cafe emptied, Emma and Ethan found themselves sitting across from each other again. The light from the window painted golden stripes across the table. She was sketching without thinking, and he was quietly watching her hand move. "You draw when you're happy," said softly. "And when I'm trying not to think too much," she replied, smiling faintly. He tilted his head, studying her. "What are you thinking about now?" She looked up from her sketchbook. "You." The air grew still. He didn't look away, but his eyes softened. his voice low. "You shouldn't." "Why not?" she asked gently. "Because I don't want to hurt you," he said. Emma smiled sadly. "You're not. You couldn't." For a long moment they said nothing. The city outside was alive. Laughter, traffic, music drifting through open doors. Inside it felt like time had slowed. Finally, Ethan exhaled and leaned back. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "I think about what life could have been if things were simpler. But life isn't simple, is it?" She shook her head. "No, but maybe that's what makes it beautiful." He smiled at that, and for a second it felt like they both understood that some connections aren't about what happens next, but what they teach you in the moment. As they stood to leave, Ethan held the door open for her. Outside, the city lights reflected in puddles on the street. He walked beside her for a few blocks, not saying much. Then, before they parted ways, he stopped and said softly, "Thank you for not walking away that day." Emma looked up at him, her heart full. "Thank you for being there when I needed someone to look at me like I mattered." They stood there in the fading light. Two people brought together by chance, held by something unspoken. Neither called it love, but maybe that's what it was. Something quiet, patient, and kind. When Emma finally went home that night, she opened her sketchbook. On the page where she had once drawn Ethan sitting alone, she added two small figures beside him, a woman and a child. Then she added another sketch, the two of them walking in the rain, side by side, not together, but not apart either. She looked at the drawing for a long moment, then whispered, "He wasn't alone, and neither am I anymore." And for the first time in a long time, she felt peace. Spring slowly turned to early summer, and the city of Seattle began to glow under longer days and golden evenings. The cafe that once held silence and rain now filled with laughter, sunlight, and the scent of fresh pastries. For Emma, it had become more than just a place to sketch. It was where her world had quietly changed. Every visit carried a memory, every table a story. And most of those stories now included Ethan. They never defined what they were to each other, but there was an ease between them that didn't need labels. Some days he'd drop by her art booth at the weekend market, holding two coffees, one for him, one for her, just the way she liked it, extra cream, no sugar. Other days she'd find him waiting at their favorite cafe table, notebook open, pen resting beside it, as if he'd been saving that spot just for her. Their conversations stretched between laughter and quiet honesty. Ethan shared more about his life, his work as an architect slowly coming back, his bond with his sister and nephew, his efforts to rebuild after years of feeling lost. Emma listened, always patient, always kind. In return, she shared pieces of her dreams, her fears of being unnoticed, her belief that art could heal. Together, they built something delicate and real, not rushed, not forced. It's just two people learning how to care again. Liam, Ethan's nephew, has become the unexpected thread that tied their worlds closer. He loved Emma's sketches, often sitting beside her and drawing messy superheroes with crayons. "You make Uncle Ethan smile," Liam once said innocently, without looking up. Emma had laughed softly, but that simple line stayed with her for days. Still, beneath all the warmth, there was something unspoken between them. A quiet distance neither crossed. It wasn't fear. It was respect. Ethan had told her once that he wasn't ready for more, that he was still figuring himself out. Emma understood. She didn't need promises or big words. She just wanted the truth, and he gave her that dot. One evening near the start of summer, they met at the cafe again. The golden light filtered through the windows, making everything glow. Emma was sketching, her pencil dancing across the page, when Ethan arrived looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. "Long day?" she asked, smiling. "Busy, but good," he replied, sitting down. "We've finally finished the design project I told you about. It's been months of stress." "I'm proud of you," she said simply. He chuckled. "You say that like you're part of it." She looked up from her sketchbook. "I kind of am. I was your free therapist through it all." He laughed, and for a moment, the world outside didn't matter. Then he grew quiet, his gaze softening as he watched her draw. "You know," he said after a pause, "I think meeting you reminded me that there's still more to life than what I lost." Emma stopped sketching. "You didn't lose everything, Ethan. You just forgot how much you still have." He smiled at that, but there was emotion in his eyes, the kind that speaks louder than words. "Maybe," he said, "I'm starting to remember." The cafe lights dimmed as evening settled in. They talked about dreams and travel, about what-ifs and maybes. Ethan told her he wanted to take Liam to the mountains that summer. Emma shared her plan to hold her first small art exhibition. "You'll come, right?" she asked softly. "Of course," he said without hesitation. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." Weeks passed, and the bond between them deepened in quiet, unspoken ways. Sometimes they'd walk together after sunset, just talking about simple things, movies, books, or memories that shaped them. Other times they'd sit in silence, both lost in thought, but still connected. During her exhibition, Ethan showed up early with Claire and Liam. He helped her set up, carried frames, and smiled proudly as people admired her work. When someone bought her first piece, he clapped louder than anyone else. Later that night, when the gallery emptied, he found her standing by the window, looking at the city lights. "You did it," he said softly. Emma turned to him, her voice trembling with quiet happiness. "I couldn't have done it without you." He shook his head. "You could have. But I'm glad I was here." They stood close, closer than before. The air between them carried something heavy and warm, a feeling neither could ignore anymore. Ethan reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "You know," he said gently, "sometimes I wonder what might have been if we met in another time. When I wasn't healing." Emma looked up at him, her heart steady but full. "I think we met at the right time," she said. "Maybe we're both healing together." Smiled, his thumb grazing her hand before he stepped back slightly, breaking the moment just enough to keep it safe. "You always know what to say," he whispered, after that night. Things between them stayed calm, but something had changed, not in words, but in the way they looked at each other. They didn't need to rush. They both knew what was there. By late summer, Ethan's life had found balance again. His work flourished. Claire and Liam were happy, and he smiled more often. Emma, too, had grown. Her art was being noticed, and she had found peace in her own company. But through it all, they kept meeting. Same cafe, same window, same quiet warmth. One evening, as the first autumn leaves began to fall, they sat together once more. The air outside was cool, and soft music played in the background. Emma looked out the window, her voice calm but thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what we are?" Ethan followed her gaze. "All the time," he admitted. "And every time I think about it, I realize something. It doesn't need a name. It just needs to be real." She smiled. "That's enough for me." They stayed like that for a while, talking softly, until the cafe began to close. As they stood to leave, Ethan gently took her hand. "Emma," he said, "you've changed the way I see the world. You made me want to feel again." Her eyes softened. "You made me believe good people still exist." They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The moment itself felt whole, pure, peaceful, and full of meaning as they walked out into the cool night, street lights flickering above them. Emma thought about that first day, the rain, the stranger, the sketch. How she once thought he was alone, and how she'd been wrong. He wasn't alone then, and neither was she now. Sometimes love doesn't rush in loudly. It grows quietly, like sunlight through clouds, steady and gentle. That was the kind of love they had, the kind that didn't demand, didn't break, but simply stayed as they parted ways that night. Ethan turned and smiled at her from across the street. "See you tomorrow?" he asked. Emma nodded, her heart full. "Always." The rain began again, light and familiar, the same way it had started months ago. But this time, she didn't feel the cold. She smiled, tucking her sketchbook under her arm. Knowing that some stories don't need perfect endings, just honest ones, and as the rain fell softly around her, she whispered to herself, "I thought he was alone. But maybe he was waiting for me all along."